I won't let my homeless father-in-law live with us. Am I wrong? I've been married for 15 years. My father-in-law has never been very involved in our lives, beyond visiting us from time to time. We have 3 children, ranging from early adolescence to preschool age. My father-in-law has been married 4 or 5 times. He has been arrested or detained by the police multiple times for domestic violence throughout his life, most recently with his last wife a few years ago. As he has aged, his life has slowly deteriorated due to bad decisions. He lost the family business, ended up in a psychiatric hospital, sold his building, and sent all the money from the sale to scammers, romance scams, and promises of doubling his money. After selling the business, my husband traveled across the country, his biggest mistake before realizing how bad things could get, and moved him to our state by himself. We let him stay with us while we found him a place. He arrived with over $80,000 from the sale of the building and his Social Security. His car was fully paid off. My husband got him a job at his workplace. While he stayed with us, we didn't ask him for a single penny. He didn't even pay for his own food. He never even offered. One day, he told us he had sent $70,000 to someone who promised him a $300,000 grant. Obviously a scam. The police couldn't help him. He had sent the money through cryptocurrency, iTunes gift cards, and Facebook transactions. At least he still had his Social Security and a part-time job, right? My husband helped him find an apartment and moved all his belongings there. Shortly after, he sold his fully paid car and bought a car with a $600 monthly payment. Then, within 3 months, he was fired from his job for sexual harassment. He came close to being evicted when he magically met an unsuspecting woman in his retirement residence. She let him move in. They traded in his $600 car and got matching cars, now over $700 a month. They constantly fought after he refused to help around the house and was a parasite with what she called anger issues. Finally, after about 3 months, she realized the truth and kicked him out. He traveled across the country again and was living in a men's shelter. After about 2 months, one day, he texted my husband, "On my way to your driveway." Sure enough, when we woke up, this man was parked outside. Now he's homeless. He says he can't access his bank account because it's locked and is living in his car. He shows up daily asking for money and begging to stay. We've sent him to our local crisis center called Social Services. He refuses to listen to any of our advice. We offered to help if he gave my husband power of attorney over his finances. He refused. He refuses to take a memory test to rule out cognitive disorders. He can't afford anything with a $700 car payment while living on Social Security. Today, he drove to my husband's workplace. His car stalled because he ran out of gas, and he walked to my husband's jobs and demanded help, causing a scene. The situation has become unsustainable. My husband, exhausted from this burden, has started considering taking more drastic measures to prevent his father from interfering in our daily lives. But the problem is that any attempt to push him away only seems to make him more persistent. He doesn't take no for an answer, and his stubbornness only leads him to act more irrationally. We tried ignoring him, thinking that maybe he would eventually give up, but all we achieved was making him more desperate. One day, we found a note in our mailbox. It was written erratically with large underlined letters, as if it had been written in a hurry. "I can't take IT anymore. I need your help. If not, I'll do something drastic." We were worried, but at the same time, after so many years of drama and bad decisions, we didn't know if it was just another one of his manipulative tactics. We didn't know whether to ignore it or take it seriously. But the next day, the situation took an even more alarming turn. He showed up at our driveway again, but this time he wasn't alone. He was with another man, someone we didn't recognize at first. He was wearing dirty clothes and looked unkempt. My father-in-law introduced him as a friend who was also in trouble. We looked at each other, unsure of what to do. Now, not only did we have to deal with him, but also with someone else. We tried talking to him, explaining that we couldn't help him the way he wanted, but he wouldn't listen. His friend stood there, silent, watching us with a vacant stare. There was something unsettling about his presence, something that made us realize that things were about to get much worse. The presence of the stranger left us with a sense of unease that we couldn't ignore. My father-in-law stood at the entrance of the house, arms crossed and a defiant look in his eyes, as if he expected us to give in immediately. His friend remained still, hands in the pockets of his tattered jacket, silently watching us. My husband tried to stay calm. He took a step forward and said to his father in a firm but steady tone, "Dad, we've talked about this. We can't help you unless you follow our conditions." My father-in-law frowned, exhaling sharply. Conditions? Since when do children set conditions for their parents? He spat with disdain. "I'm homeless. I have no money, and you're here living comfortably. You can't ignore me." "It's not about ignoring you," I said, feeling I had to step in. "It's about the fact that every time we try to help, you make choices that bring you back to the same point. We can't keep going in this endless cycle." His friend cleared his throat, as if he wanted to speak but wasn't sure if he should. Finally, in a rough voice, he said, "Look, man, it's not right to leave your old man on the street. You could at least give him a roof over his head." His tone wasn't exactly threatening, but something about the way he spoke put us on edge. My husband looked at his father and then at the stranger. His jaw was tight. "We can help you find a shelter," he offered patiently. "There are assistance centers that could support you, but you need to cooperate." My father-in-law let out a sarcastic laugh. "A shelter? I'm not a stray dog. You're not going to dump me in a place full of addicts and criminals. I'll stay here with you. It's the right thing to do." A chill ran down my spine. His insistence wasn't new, but this time, something was different. The way he looked at us, his posture, his desperation was reaching a dangerous level. "We can't allow that," my husband said firmly. "We can't." The stranger shifted slightly, tilting his head, evaluating us with an unreadable expression. My father-in-law sighed dramatically and looked at his friend. "Let's go. We'll leave for now." Without another word, they turned around and walked away. We stood at the entrance, watching as they got into the stranger's battered car and disappeared down the street. But the relief was fleeting. We knew this wasn't over. That night, after making sure all the doors were locked, we sat in the living room to discuss what to do. My husband was frustrated, exhausted. "He's not going to stop," he said bitterly. "He'll keep pushing until we give in or until he does something worse." I nodded silently. I knew he was right. Our father-in-law had shown time and again that he had no limits. And the worst part was that we had no idea what he was capable of if he felt desperate enough. The next morning, everything seemed calm. There was no sign of my father-in-law or his strange companion. We relaxed a little, though deep down, we knew we shouldn't let our guard down. And sure enough, our peace didn't last long. That same afternoon, we received a call from an unknown number. My husband answered, and his expression changed instantly. "What?" he asked, frowning. "No, that's not possible. Where is he?" My heart began to pound. When he hung up, he looked at me with a mix of disbelief and concern. "Dad was arrested." My mouth fell slightly open. It wasn't the first time, but still, the news shook us. "Why?" I asked, feeling a knot form in my stomach. "He tried to break into a house. They found him inside someone's garage." My mind filled with questions. Why would he do that? Was it a random house? Or was there a reason behind his actions? But what terrified me most was that we still didn't know the full extent of the situation. Because if the past had taught us anything, it was that every time we thought he had hit rock bottom, he somehow found a way to sink even lower. However, what we didn't know at that moment was that this time, everything would be different. That what had happened that night was only the beginning of something much bigger. Something we wouldn't be able to control. The arrest of my father-in-law was just the beginning of a spiral of events that would shake our lives in ways we could never have anticipated. My husband and I sat in the living room in silence, both trying to process what we had just heard. "He tried to break into someone's house," my husband repeated in disbelief. His hands trembled slightly as he ran them through his hair. My first thought was that maybe his mental state had deteriorated more than we had realized. Or perhaps he simply had nowhere to go and had tried to sneak into any house for shelter. But something didn't add up. My father-in-law had a way of manipulating situations to his advantage, and this seemed too impulsive, even for him. "Do we know who owns the house?" I asked. My husband shook his head. "They didn't tell me over the phone, but they said someone found him in the garage before he could get inside. They called the police immediately." A chill ran down my spine. Something about this unsettled me deeply. We decided to go to the police station to try to get more information, not because we wanted to help him, but because we wanted to understand what was really happening. When we arrived, the atmosphere was tense. We approached the front desk and asked about him. They made us wait a few minutes before an officer came to speak with us. "Are you relatives of Alan Thompson?" the officer asked in a monotone voice. "Yes, his son," my husband replied. The officer looked at us with an expression of annoyance, as if he was already tired of dealing with my father-in-law. "He was found inside a private garage," he explained. "The homeowner heard noises and caught him before he could do anything else. He wasn't armed, but he resisted arrest. He claimed the house was his and that he had been unfairly thrown out." My husband and I exchanged a silent glance. This didn't make sense. We knew he was losing control of his life, but this was something more serious. "What happens now?" my husband asked tensely. "That depends on the homeowners," replied the officer. "If they press charges, he could face jail time. If they don't, he might be released with a warning, but he'll still have to appear before a judge." We remained silent. The idea of him being let out just like that worried us. What would he do next? Would he try to come back to us? "Can we talk to him?" my husband finally asked. The officer hesitated for a moment before nodding and leading us to a small visitation room. We waited there until they brought my father-in-law in. When he finally appeared, he looked disheveled. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair messy, but his eyes gleamed with a mix of resentment and scorn. "I knew you'd come," he said with a bitter smile as he sat across from us. "Are you here to get me out or just to gloat?" My husband sighed in frustration. "Dad, what were you doing in that house?" "None of your business," he replied, crossing his arms. "I know what I'm doing." "Clearly you don't," I interjected. "You're in jail, Dad. This isn't just a misunderstanding." He stared at us for a moment before shaking his head. "I lived there," he finally said, his voice full of anger. "That was my house." We froze. We knew that wasn't true. He had spent the past few months wandering aimlessly. He hadn't had a home of his own since losing his last apartment. "No, Dad, that's not your house," my husband said firmly. "Yes, it is," he insisted. "They took it from me. They stole it." The confusion in our minds deepened. This wasn't just a blatant lie. He genuinely believed what he was saying. My husband and I exchanged a worried glance. Was he completely losing touch with reality? "Well, see what we can do," my husband finally said, standing up. We left the room with more questions than answers. Something was wrong, beyond his bad decisions and stubborn pride. His mind seemed to be unraveling at an alarming rate. That night, after we returned home, we received another call. This time, it was from the officer we had spoken to earlier. "I just wanted to inform you," said the officer in a warning tone. "He was released a few minutes ago." My husband's face went pale. "What? I thought they were keeping him until the hearing." "The homeowners decided not to press charges. They didn't want to get involved in legal trouble, so they let it go," explained the officer. "But it advised you to stay alert." He didn't seem very stable when he left. We hung up without saying a word. We both knew what this meant. He would show up at our doorstep at any moment. And we weren't wrong. At 3 in the morning, a loud pounding on the door jolted us awake. We looked at each other, neither of us wanting to move. Then, a familiar voice rang out from the other side. "Open the damn door. I know you're in there. This is my house," he shouted. The situation had completely spiraled out of control. My father-in-law wasn't just desperate. He was now convinced that he had the right to force his way into our home. We knew that if we gave in, if we opened that door, he would never leave. And the worst part was that, in his current state, we had no idea what he was capable of. The sound of another heavy blow against the door sent shivers down my spine. We knew we had to make a decision, and fast. But what we didn't know was that the worst was yet to come. The pounding on the door continued, growing louder each time, as if it was only a matter of moments before it would be knocked down. My husband and I looked at each other, both feeling the same fear tightening in our chests. We couldn't keep ignoring it. My husband took a deep breath, stepped closer to the door, and without opening it, spoke in a firm voice. "Dad, you need to leave. This is my house," he shouted from the other side. "You can't throw me out of my own home." I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling a knot in my stomach. This was no longer just an argument with someone stubborn and desperate. My father-in-law was convinced of something that wasn't real. "Well, call the police if you don't leave," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. A tense silence followed. Then we heard his breathing grow heavier on the other side of the door. Finally, He struck the door one last time before stepping away. We peeked through the window and saw him walk to his car, start the engine, and speed off. We had no idea where he was going or what he would do next, but at least for that night, we wouldn't have to face him. The next morning, we both felt exhausted. We had barely slept, and the tension still lingered in the air. My husband checked his phone and saw several messages from unknown numbers. They all said similar things. "You can't do this to me. You know I'm right. We'll see each other soon." The last message was the one that unsettled us the most. It wasn't a direct threat, but it made it clear that this wasn't over. We decided to go to the police again. When we arrived at the station, a different officer attended to us this time. We explained the situation, showed him the messages, and told him about the pounding on our door. "We can file a report," said the officer, "but until he does something more serious, there's not much we can do." My husband clenched his fists. We knew waiting for something more serious to happen was dangerous, but we had no other choice. A few days passed with no sign of him. We relaxed a little, thinking that maybe he had finally given up. But then, one evening, when we came home after work, we found something that sent a chill down our spines. The back door was open. My husband and I looked at each other, our hearts pounding. We knew we had locked it before leaving. We entered cautiously, checking every room. The house was in order. Nothing seemed to have been stolen. But then we reached the living room and saw what was on the table. It was a picture of our family. A framed photo we usually kept on the hallway shelf, now placed at the center of the table with a knife stabbed through it. My husband took a deep breath, trying to suppress both his fear and rage. I covered my mouth with my hand, feeling a shiver crawl up my spine. "He was here," I whispered. "Yeah," my husband said quietly, "and this is a warning." There were no signs of forced entry, which meant he had found a way in without being noticed. Did he have a key? Had he entered while we were still home and hidden until we left? We called the police immediately. This time, they took the situation more seriously. They sent an officer to check the house and take fingerprints. They advised us to change the locks and consider additional security measures. That night, we installed security cameras at every entrance. We didn't know when he would come back, but we were sure he would, and he did. 2 nights later at 2 a.m., the sound of an alert on our phones woke us up. We checked the camera feed, and there he was, standing in the driveway, staring directly into the lens. He didn't knock this time. He didn't yell. He just stood there, motionless, watching us. We called the police immediately. As we waited for them to arrive, we kept watching the live feed from the camera. At one point, he slowly lifted his hand and pointed at the house, as if he was claiming it. Then, just as slowly, he smiled. By the time the patrol cars arrived, he was gone. But we knew this wouldn't be the last time we saw him. The image of my father-in-law on the security camera remained burned in our minds. His smile, his unblinking stare at the house, the threatening gesture of pointing his finger. We knew he wouldn't stop. After that night, my husband and I took even more precautions. We installed more cameras, reinforced the locks, and for the first time, seriously considered getting a restraining order. But deep down, we knew that wouldn't guarantee he'd stay away. Days passed with no sign of him. The tension was unbearable. Every shadow on the street seemed suspicious. Every noise at night made us jump out of bed. We knew he was waiting for the right moment to return. And he did. It was a particularly silent night. Our children were asleep, blissfully unaware of the nightmare unfolding around us. My husband and I had gone to bed late, unable to relax. Around 3 a.m., the sound of the security camera alert jolted us awake. My husband grabbed his phone and checked the live feed. There he was. But this time, he wasn't alone. There was another man with him. Someone taller, dressed in a dark jacket and a cap that hid his face. They stood at the entrance for several minutes, whispering to each other, but the cameras couldn't pick up what they were saying. Then my father-in-law pulled something out of his pocket. My husband increased the screen brightness, and his face went pale. It was a key. We looked at each other, terrified. How had he gotten a key? Had he kept a copy from when he lived with us? Before we could react, the front doorknob began to turn. My husband sprinted to the door and held it shut with all his strength. From the other side, we could hear my father-in-law's breathing. "Open up," he whispered, his tone disturbingly calm. "This is my house." "Get out of here, Dad," my husband shouted. "The police are on their way." We didn't know if that was true. We hadn't called yet, but we hoped it would make him hesitate. However, he showed no signs of backing down. "I know you want me here," he continued. "This is all just a misunderstanding. Just let me in and we'll talk." His companion remained silent, but his shadow through the peephole told us he was watching every move we made. Then we heard it, a loud thud against the back door. I spun toward the kitchen, my heart hammering in my chest. Someone else was trying to break in. We had no choice. With shaking hands, I dialed 911 while my husband pressed against the door with all his strength. "There are people trying to break into my house," I said, my voice trembling. "One of them is my father-in-law. He's been harassing us for weeks. Please, send help." The operator assured us that a patrol was on its way, but every second felt like an eternity. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. The house fell into an eerie silence. We checked the camera again and saw my father-in-law and his companion slowly walking away. One of them turned back and raised a hand, waving mockingly. Then, they disappeared into the darkness. Minutes later, the police arrived, but it was too late. They searched the property, took our statements, and promised to patrol the neighborhood more frequently. But we knew that wouldn't be enough. That night, we didn't sleep. It was getting worse each time. He was becoming bolder, more unpredictable. And the most unsettling part was that now he wasn't alone. Who was the man with him? What were they planning to do if they had gotten inside? The next morning, my husband made a decision. He started making calls. First to a lawyer, then to a private security company. We couldn't keep waiting for something terrible to happen. We needed to act before it was too late. But before we could implement any new measures, we received a message from an unknown number. It was a video. When we opened it, a cold dread crept over us. It was a recording of our children, captured at the park where they played in the afternoons, completely unaware that someone had been watching them. The message that accompanied the video was clear. "If you don't let me in, someone else will." My husband clenched the phone so tightly I thought he might break it. I, on the other hand, couldn't hold back the tears. This wasn't just a threat. It was a declaration of war. We knew this wouldn't end until someone did something drastic. The only question was, who would act first? The message with the video of our children left us frozen in place. We knew that my father-in-law had crossed a line we could no longer ignore. This wasn't just harassment. It wasn't just persistence. It was a real threat, a warning that if we didn't do what he wanted, someone else would suffer the consequences. That same morning, my husband and I sat at the kitchen table, cups of coffee trembling in our hands. We couldn't keep living like this. We couldn't wait for him to take the next step. "This ends today," my husband finally said. "No matter what we have to do, we're putting a stop to this now." We knew that calling the police once again wouldn't be enough. They had come before, listened to our complaints, filed our reports, but my father-in-law always found a way to avoid real consequences. What we needed was something definitive, something that would ensure he would never threaten us again. My husband contacted the lawyer he had spoken to days earlier. He explained the new threat, and this time, the lawyer sounded more concerned than before. He told us that we already had enough evidence to file for a restraining order, and with this latest threat against our children, we could get it immediately. That same morning, we went to the courthouse. We explained our situation, and thanks to the videos and messages we had saved, the order was granted without hesitation. The police were notified right away and promised that if he tried to come near us again, he would be arrested. But we couldn't rely on that alone. My husband hired a private security firm to monitor our home. We installed new locks, reinforced the windows, and hardest of all, we decided to send our children to stay with a relative until we were absolutely certain the danger had passed. 2 nights later, the moment we had dreaded arrived. At 2:37 a.m., the cameras picked up my father-in-law's car parking a few blocks from the house. He walked slowly along the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, his face cold and unreadable. He wasn't alone. The same man who had accompanied him before was with him, but this time, we were ready. Before he could get any closer, 2 police patrol cars appeared out of nowhere, their flashing lights illuminating the street. My father-in-law and his accomplice froze for a second. Then, they tried to run. They didn't get far. The officers tackled them within moments, pinning them to the ground and handcuffing them without resistance. My husband and I watched from the window, not saying a word. We didn't feel relief. We didn't feel victory. just an overwhelming exhaustion, like we had finally reached the end of an endless marathon. Hours later at the police station, we were informed that my father-in-law was facing serious charges: harassment, threats, attempted break-in, violation of the restraining order. His accomplice had a criminal record and was also being charged. This time, he wouldn't get away so easily. 2 weeks later, our children returned home. The tension still lingered in the air, but we knew we were safe. We knew this nightmare was finally over. The last time we saw my father-in-law was during his preliminary hearing. He looked at us with pure hatred as he was escorted out of the courtroom, but he no longer had any power over us. This time, finally, it was over.